In this video, I'm going to show you how to take the search filter dropdown from the how-to section of W3 schools and convert it into Svelte. This is what the filter dropdown menu does. Click a button to show the menu, and then we can type and have it filter through the anchor tags that they provided. For the Svelte side, I'm going to go ahead and just do it right on their website, right inside their REPL. You can go ahead and create a little account and then save them in there. And I'm going to go ahead and copy their code. So here's the HTML. And below the script tag, I'm going to make a style tag. And then just copy all the CSS from there. Okay, and we will get some errors down here because this is HTML and CSS, and Svelte operates a little bit differently, so we'll clean that up soon. We're going to go ahead and also just leave the JavaScript alone, but you can go ahead and study that if you want and see how regular vanilla JavaScript would get the job done. So when we take a look at this code here, we can see there's a number of anchor tags. We have a button, and we have an outer container. I'm going to go ahead and alter some of this as well. I'll call this a section tag instead. And I'll keep the inner part a div. Feels a little bit clearer to me. And I'll get rid of this part in the script tag. We don't need that. And so to get started, let's go ahead and look at the button, and there's an on-click event listener, and we'll change that to Svelte syntax. And we'll just go ahead and console log good. So the button works. You can go ahead and just put an inline function here, but we could also put that function up inside these script tags, which we'll do a little bit later. The next thing we want to do is look at this input, and here's another event listener listening for a key up event. So let's go ahead and change that to Svelte syntax. And it looks like they have a function that they've created called filter function, which we'll go ahead and just use that. And we'll put that up here in the script tags. And again, we'll just quickly console log. Now this isn't going to work quite yet because we don't have the ability to see the menu yet. And it looks like the way the menu works is it adds this show class at the bottom here. In fact, that's what the warning is down here. You have a CSS selector show that's being unused. So let's figure out how to incorporate that the Svelte way. And we basically want to show this drop down when, let's go ahead and create a Boolean here. Call this show menu. We'll set it to false. And the way you would do this is within the div, we'll go ahead and say add the class show when show menu is equal to true. So we can do this, but we can also just use shorthand, and just the existence of show menu by itself is a true value. If we wanted to do it based on false, we could just put bang in front. So add the show class to this div when this variable is true. So how do we toggle this value between true and false? That's what the button's going to do. So now instead of console logging this button, let's go ahead and remove that. We'll say show menu, assign it to the opposite value of whatever it is. If it's currently true, make it false. If it's currently false, make it true. So now if we click this button, now the menu will show. And the reason this is showing is because this class show is being added to this div. And just to take another look again, the show class inside the CSS is just using a display property and setting it to block. And so if we click it again, that show class is moving away. In fact, let's just go ahead and see that. Okay, there's the show. There it is. So if I click this again, then that disappears. Click it again and it comes back. So just as we expected. And that's the way vanilla JavaScript would work as well. But with this special Svelte syntax, we can go ahead and use this shorthand. Add the class show when menu is true. So that's working. Let's go ahead and hide this again. Well, actually, no, let's don't hide it. Let's now look at our input. So we said on key up. So when we come in here and start typing, when the key is up, call this filter function. And the filter function is console logging the word typing. So let's just try that. Yep, and it's working. So now the question is how do we get this filter function to work properly? And this is going to be based on the value property here. So we need to be able to get the value of this input. Let's create a variable. We'll call it input value. Set it to an empty string. And then we'll go ahead and bind the value of this input's value. We'll bind it to the variable that we just made up here. So instead of now console logging the word typing, let's console log the input value. So by binding this input's value to this variable, as soon as this value changes, because we're console logging it, we should be able to see it. And so as we're typing, we're able to, I can remove characters and it does the same. So now it ends up with an empty string. Good. So now that we have that bound to this HTML element and bound to this variable, we now have the value that we're typing in here. So in order to filter through these, we need to see when this element text content matches this input value, then we want to basically exclude everything else but this. But here's the interesting thing, and this is where it differs. This is where Svelte's going to differ from a regular JavaScript project where all of these DOM elements are going to remain there. Because we're using a component-based system here, we're not going to want to hard code this in. This is not like vanilla JavaScript where we're going to add a hide class on the ones we don't want to see and then remove that hide class. We need to dynamically actually generate this. And in order to do that, let's go ahead and make another variable, and we'll call this MenuItems. We'll make this an array, and we'll just store these values in there. Okay, so we have this array of string values. And what we're going to do is we're going to create another component. And we'll call this MenuItem. So we'll start with some script tags. Style tag, and our component is just basically this anchor tag. And we'll need a variable that's going to match, it's going to help us fill this value in. So why don't we call this label. And then we'll have to replace that with some Svelte syntax. And it looks like the IDs, or excuse me, it looks like the links, yeah, they're just all lowercase versions of the text content. So what we could do there is replace this word with some Svelte syntax, the curly braces, and then go ahead and put label. And then we can go ahead and just add an expression here to lowercase. And then the other thing we need to do is just bring in the CSS for this anchor tag. Let's see what that is. Here it is. Just okay. We'll need the A. We'll need both of these. So I can get rid of that from the app component and just paste it into the MenuItem component. Now we don't need this because it's referencing a class that doesn't exist in this component. We can just keep the anchor tag and it will know what to do. And then the last thing we need to do is import this, because the app component doesn't know what MenuItem is until we bring it in. Okay, so now if we go ahead and remove this, and then we open the menu, now we just see the input, and we don't see our links rendering yet. We'll add a Svelte each loop, and we'll say, we'll reference this array right here because we want to loop through this array and grab each string value. So each menu items as, and then the singular, I'll just call it item. Then we'll end it. And then in between here, this is where we're going to go ahead and add our MenuItem component. And what we're missing here is this label. Now, one thing I haven't done yet is I haven't exported this. It's not going to know what this value is unless I export it. And now that it's being exported and the component's being imported into app, I can say label, which matches this variable. Label is going to equal item. And what is item? Item is actually each element within this array. So each menu items as item. So each item comes through, and we're going to set label to be that item. Let's see if it worked. And it did. And if we check the HTML that was created, we'll see here's our text content that is there, but also look at the href. It still included the about, base, blog, contact, and it did it exactly the way that they had it over here at W3 Schools How-To. And it even did lowercase because we instructed it to. Over here in this component, we said, hey, include the label and 2 lowercase. So it looks like our HTML is rendering just fine. So this is more of a component-based way of doing things. Instead of hard coding these anchor tags in like this, we'll render them using an array. Now, of course, we can keep adding things to this array. So we can type in whatever we want. We can make this array be as long as we want. Each loop will still loop through it and give us all those back as anchor tags. So we more or less have the elements on the page. Now we just have to solve this last part here of filtering through. So when I type, for example, the word tools, also you see this menu here. This is something that I don't want to see. So I think I'm going to do autocomplete and change it to, is it off? Yeah. This may not work in all browsers anyway. This is just a quick solution now. Autocomplete off will take whatever past searches you've done and not show them. So good. So now we can see our anchor tags, and now the job of this input is if I type, for example, the word about, we should just see this about anchor and none of the others. So the question is, how do we do that in Svelte? Right now we're rendering this list of anchor tags, but we really only want to render the ones that are matching this search criteria. So let's go ahead and create another array, and we'll call this filtered items. And I'm just going to set it to an empty array. This is going to be a very flexible one that will add things to that match the input value here. And so that's going to lead us to this function. This is what this function should do. This function should take the input value and if each of these elements matches this input value, then go ahead and let's add those to this empty filtered items array. So we'll take this, and luckily JavaScript's got a very convenient method. And what we'll do is we'll take MenuItem and we'll filter it. I'm going to take this out. We'll filter all items in the array where item, we can just play this safe right now. We'll just say if it's equal to input value. We'll refine this, but that's basically the idea. So as I'm typing in, if item equals what I'm typing in, then go ahead and save it into this empty filtered array. And then let's go ahead and console log filtered items as it changes. Should we camel case that? So filtered items, filtered items. I'm going to take that console log out. So this function, filtered function, is going to be called on every key up. So let me just start typing exactly the word about. Oh, good, and it did. As soon as I finished the word, it saved it in this empty array, filtered items, and that's what we're looking at here. So that's when there's an exact match, but that's not really what we're going to do. I mean, you don't want to have to wait for somebody to type out exactly the thing. But before we go on to that, since we are getting an exact match, let's figure out how to show that here. So in this area here, we're rendering our menu of anchor tags, and we're rendering them when we want to see everything. But now we need to actually render filtered items in place of this when we actually do have some items in here. So with Svelte, we can just do an if statement. And let's just say if filtered items has a length greater than 0, that means there's at least one item in there, then we'll render, instead of doing this each loop for menu item, we'll do it for, instead of looping through menu items here, we'll loop through filtered items. Let me just push that in a little bit. And so this second part, using Svelte syntax, we would do an else. So let's just look at this. So if this array has at least one item in it, then let's loop through each of the items and we'll render this menu item component that we created. Else, go ahead and just render, go ahead and loop through menu items and render all of the items. Render all of the anchor tags. So right now, if we do it, you can see they're all rendered. But if I type in the word about, see, filtered items has the string about in it, and our menu now is truncated to just the word about. So if I erase it, then all the items come back again. Let's try the word tools. Tools goes to filtered items. The menu truncates down to just tools, and as I start erasing, now let's go to filter function and let's see if we can tweak this a little bit. So now we're basically saying if item, we could do something like dot includes. If menu item includes some part of input value, let's try that. So now again, I have to be exact. Yeah, see now about comes up, even if with just the A. Or even for, how about tools? I won't even start with T. I'll just start with OOLS, and yeah. And so includes is one way we can do it. Another way we could do it, there's a regex method called match. Let's try that now. Tools. Let's see, we have here New Zealand. So if I just even type EA, you can see it grabs the EA in New Zealand. Now that's one way to do it. But you can see we got a problem here. If I do a lowercase a, the word about, the link with about doesn't show up. So let's make it easier for the users. Let's basically say if item dot, well, actually we'll force it to lowercase. So basically we're taking each of these elements as they come in, we'll force it to lowercase. And we'll say match the input that we typed in, whatever we typed in here, let's also force that to lowercase. So now no matter what we type, and no matter what element comes through the filter, they'll all be lowercase. So now this should be really convenient. I should be able to just type A and see now about is included. Now, of course, it includes other things too, which have one A in it. But it makes it easy. You don't have to hold down the shift key. I can type anything I want. Zebra comes back even with a small Z and an E. So this is a much better way to do it. Now the match method is probably the better one to use. I mean, we could probably use includes, but it's a newer method. And I know it's probably not going to be supported for older incarnations of Internet Explorer. But that said, we're going through Svelte, and Svelte is compiling this all into, browser-friendly JavaScript. So we could probably use includes or match. Okay, from this point on, let's go ahead and take the things that we've done and break them into other components. And while we may not actually need to do that, it's just still good practice to figure out how to pass props or pass event listeners in Svelte. So we'll go ahead and do that. Now, before we do that, though, I just want to go ahead and make the text content for this button toggle so we can do any kind of JavaScript expression we want. So I'm going to do a ternary in here, and Svelte requires these curly braces. And I think what I want to say is if show menu is true, then we'll change the text content to hide menu. Else we'll change the text content to show menu. So right now it's false, and when I click the button, remember the button has got this on-click listener and then the handler here, which toggles that value. So I click and make it true, and then the text content changes to hide menu based on this ternary statement that we made here. Now, centering on the button, let's go ahead and add another component, and we'll call it button. I tell you what, I'm just going to copy all this code, put it over here, and I'm going to get rid of everything I don't need. And as far as the styles, I think I just need the things for the button. So style is done, and then okay, now as far as the ternary, we'll go ahead and keep that. The class is fine. And then now when we get to the event listener, we don't actually need this part. What we're going to do is we're going to pass the on-click up. And so we just need to put this much on : click, and that's enough. And then we'll pass that up to the app component. And we'll do that by importing the button. And then in our styles, we can go ahead and get rid of this CSS rule because the button already has those rules. And then inside here, this is now a component. So we don't need a closing tag. We don't need the ternary. Self-closing, and then we capitalize button since it's a component. And then here's the on-click. And so within button, we just made a reference to it. And then once we get to app, we actually need to use it. So inside app, we use onClick, and we go ahead and call that anonymous function we had before, which toggles the true-false value of show menu. And that should be enough. Let's see what happens. So the menu works, but the button's text is not changing. And what would cause that? Okay, so we are passing show menu inside the button component, but we haven't exported it. And because we haven't exported it, this value is not seen by app. Now inside app, you can see we have the exact same variable, and it's already set to a value. So let's go ahead and remove this value. And then app has the same value. And then now in order for that Boolean value to show up, we need to come down to the button component and put it in here. This is kind of the pipeline. Without this here, then there is no throughway to the button. This value won't be known unless we first export it and then make reference to it inside the button component. Now we're using curly braces and show menu because we're using the same variable name. If this were a different variable name, let's just say menu, then we would come back here and do something like menu equals show menu. That's if the variable names were different, but they're the same, so we can use this shortcut that Svelte provides us, curly braces show menu. So now that piping is there, let's see. Now the button turn area is working. So the next part of this that we could probably turn into a component is this input. So let's go ahead and take that and create another component. I'm going to just copy this from here so we have some quick script and style tags. And then inside app, we'll take the input. And this has an ID of my input. So let's look for that inside. Here it is, my input. So I'll cut that out of the app component. Put it inside here. I'm going to actually take these style tags inside of app and just cut it out and put it below that, just so we don't have to keep closing it. Okay, so then let's go ahead and import the input component. We'll come down here and use a capital I, self-closing tag. Now let's jump back over to the component again and see what we can change here. So here is our event listener. Remember, we don't need to call a function until all we need to do is pass the event listener event type. So we can get rid of the handler. And we're going to pass on key upward to the app. We're going to bind the value to input value, but there is no input value here. So let's come back here and just copy this, put it here. And just like we had to do it in the button, we have to export this. If we don't, then it won't make a piping between the two components. So we'll export input value. We'll still bind the value to input value. Autocomplete off, that's fine. Placeholder, type text, good. Coming back over to app, now we don't need type text. Since this is a component, we don't need placeholder. We don't need autocomplete off. We do need bind value, but it's actually a bit different. We've already done bind value to input here. So in app, inside the input component, what we need to do is just bind to the input value. And this input value is right up here. We gave it the same variable name just to keep it clean. We don't need the ID anymore since this is the input component rather than the input HTML element. And then here's our on key up. And then we now need to flesh out the right side of this, which is the event handler. Still calls filter function, which is there. And I think that should do it. Let's try it. It looks like it still works. Yep. Okay, and so that's how we can take that same functional filter app and branch it out into components and then import the components inside app. And then you can see what the difference is here. Now that we have a button component, all we have to do is accommodate the curly brackets part of the component. And in this case, it's show menu. For the input, we have an input component, so we don't need all the extra stuff that was in the HTML element. We just need to accommodate the values that need to be filled in. And in this case, it's input value. And then also on key up, we have to fill in what this is going to get passed up to the app component. And then we need to fill in what the actual event handler function is. The only other thing I'm going to do is maybe add a comment here. We'll call this menu. We actually can take out this space so it's a little bit more clear that there's a section with a button, and then everything else below is going to be the menu. Yeah, that's pretty good. There's nothing else we would really want to branch out into a component.